Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation from the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. The year is 1792. A carriage rattles through the frozen streets of St. Petersburg, bearing inside it a man who once illuminated Russia with books and ideas. Nikolai Novikov, publisher, philanthropist, and Freemason, sits in silence as he's driven to the fortress of Schlisselburg. Around him, soldiers clutch their sabres. The gates ahead close like jaws. For Catherine the Great, he is no longer a reformer, but a conspirator. For the Brethren of Moscow, his imprisonment is the signal that their lodges too must fall dark. In this single night, the light of an entire movement is extinguished. Freemasonry in Russia has always been caught between fascination and suspicion. From the very first lodges founded in the 18th century to the discreet gatherings of today, it has moved through cycles of growth, suppression, silence, and revival. Each age has left its mark on the fraternity's development. There were moments when Freemasonry was at the heart of intellectual and philanthropic life, and others when it was driven to the margins, denounced as subversive, and extinguished by force. In tracing its story, we must keep in mind that Masonry in Russia was never merely an imported curiosity. It became a mirror of Russia's engagement with Europe, with Enlightenment thought, with mystical spirituality, and with political reform. It also became a lightning rod for the anxieties of czars, churchmen, and commissars. Even today, the fraternity survives in Russia under conditions very different from those in Western Europe. Its membership is modest, its public presence deliberately quiet, yet it remains an established part of global Freemasonry. This lecture will follow the course of Russian Masonry from its first introduction in the age of Peter the Great, through the high tide of Catherine the Great's reign, into the ban of 1822, the brief resurgence of 1905 to 1917, the long Soviet silence, and finally, the rebirth of the Grand Lodge of Russia in 1995. Along the way, we will meet the personalities who shaped it: Ivan Yeligin, Nikolai Novikov, the Decembrists, and others. And we will close with a picture of contemporary Freemasonry in Russia today. Cautious, apolitical, but recognized and functioning within the worldwide family of regular Masonry. Imagine Moscow's German quarter in the early 1700s. In a smoky chamber, foreign officers and scientists gather at a table strewn with charts, compasses, and globes. Among them is Jacob Bruce, a Scottish general renowned as much for his experiments in alchemy as for his loyalty to Peter the Great. They speak in hushed tones, draw strange symbols, and raise their glasses to unseen ideals. Neighbours whisper that they are Freemasons, guardians of secrets never before heard in Muscovy. Whether true or not, the rumour takes hold, and with it, the idea that hidden wisdom has entered the Russian court. The story of Freemasonry in Russia begins not with operative Masons' guilds, as in England or Scotland, but with foreigners at court. In the early 18th century, Peter the Great sought to westernize his country. He surrounded himself with European officers, engineers, and scientists. Among them was the Scottish general Jacob Bruce, remembered in Moscow folklore as an alchemist and magician. Whether Bruce or Peter himself had any connection to the craft is doubtful, but their circle created an atmosphere in which such associations could later take root. The first firm evidence comes from 1731, when the Premier Grand Lodge of England appointed Captain John Phillips as Provincial Grand Master for Russia. Phillips remains an elusive figure, and it is not clear how active he was, but by the 1740s and 1750s, lodges were certainly working in St. Petersburg and Moscow, populated mainly by foreign merchants, diplomats, and officers. By the mid-1750s, Russian nobles began to join. The lodge Silence in St. Petersburg counted among its members poets, historians, and princes. For an aristocracy eager to show its sophistication, Masonry was a sign of entry into the enlightened world of Europe. To some, it offered serious philosophical discussion. To others, it was simply a fashionable diversion. It is 1785. Inside the Imperial Theatre, Catherine the Great laughs as actors parody a Masonic initiation. They swagger about with swords, promise elixirs of immortality, and collapse into drunken revelry. The court roars with delight. Yet scattered among the audience are true brethren who watch in uneasy silence. They recognize the sting in the comedy. Their empress, once a patron of enlightenment, now ridicules what they hold sacred. For them, the laughter is a warning. The lodges of Russia are no longer fashionable curiosities. They have become dangerous in the eyes of power. The real expansion came during Catherine II's reign. Ivan Yelagin, a courtier and former secretary to the Empress, became the key organizer. In the early 1770s, he brought together 14 lodges under his authority as Provincial Grand Master, recognized first from Berlin and then from London. He introduced rituals, rules, and even a blood oath ceremony to heighten the sense of solemnity. At the same time, Baron von Reichel, aligned with German and Swedish systems, created rival lodges. For several years, Russian Freemasonry was divided between Yelagin's English model and Reichel's strict observance. Eventually, a fragile unity was achieved, and in 1777, King Gustav III of Sweden himself initiated Grand Duke Paul into Masonry during a state visit to St. Petersburg. It was a glittering moment, the heir to the Russian throne received into the craft by a foreign monarch. But Catherine, who valued control above all else, would later look back on that episode with suspicion. By the 1780s, lodges flourished in both capitals. Some pursued high-degree chivalric rites, dressing in armour and drinking heavily at their agape feasts. Others sought deeper meaning in mystical and Rosicrucian traditions. The leading figure of this Moscow current was Nikolai Novikov. A writer, publisher, and philanthropist, Novikov used the support of his brethren to establish presses and schools. His publishing house issued nearly half the books printed in Russia at the height of its activity, including primers, devotional works, and translations of European philosophy. He also organized famine relief and other charitable endeavors. This blend of philanthropy and mysticism made Masonry both influential and suspect. Catherine at first tolerated it, but after the French Revolution erupted in 1789, her mood hardened. She feared any secret society with foreign ties. Novikov's presses were closed, his books confiscated, and in 1792 he was imprisoned in the fortress of Schlisselburg without trial. By 1794, almost all Russian lodges had dissolved. Catherine even ordered the demolition of her half-built palace at Tsaritsino, because its decoration reminded her of Masonic symbols. Thus ended the first golden age of Russian Freemasonry. Moscow, winter of 1815. Officers return from Paris, their uniforms still bright with medals of victory over Napoleon. In a candlelit salon, they gather, voices low, speaking of what they saw abroad. Constitutions, parliaments, new rights for citizens. One raises his hand in a Masonic gesture and says simply, "In our lodge, we are all equals." For men raised in an autocracy, it is intoxicating. These conversations, half political and half mystical, are seeds. Within a decade, they will blossom into the Decembrist revolt, the first attempt of Russia's nobility to demand a constitutional order. Catherine's death in 1796 brought her son Paul to the throne. He released Novikov and other imprisoned Masons, but did not restore their lodges. Instead, Paul poured his enthusiasm into the Order of Malta, accepting the Grand Mastership of that Catholic chivalric order and enrolling Russian nobles as Maltese knights. For the craft itself, his reign was a time of limbo. The true revival came under Alexander I. From 1803, lodges were allowed to reopen, and Masonry spread rapidly once more. Some pursued mystical study under men like Alexander Labzin, others focused on Enlightenment ideals. In 1815, the Grand Lodge Astrea was created in St. Petersburg, uniting 19 lodges. It rejected the elaborate higher degrees and insisted on equality and democracy within the lodge. At its height, it counted over 1,000 members, many of them young military officers fired with liberal ideas. But division soon reappeared. Rival lodges worked the Swedish Rite, and mutual accusations of treason or foreign manipulation reached the ears of the government. Meanwhile, some officers grew impatient with symbolic Masonry and formed secret political societies of their own. The Unions of Salvation and Prosperity, predecessors of the Decembrists, borrowed Masonic structures of oaths and cells, but aimed at constitutional reform. In 1822, Alexander, alarmed by these developments, issued a decree banning all secret societies, Masonry included. 3 years later, when he died, the Decembrists rose in revolt against his successor, Nicholas I. Many of the conspirators had once been lodge members. The uprising failed, but in the official mind, Masonry and conspiracy were now indelibly linked. Nicholas reinforced the ban, and for the rest of the century, Russian Freemasonry fell silent. Decades later, in the quiet of Yasnaya Polyana, Count Leo Tolstoy bends over his manuscript. He writes of Pierre Bezukhov, kneeling in a candlelit lodge, listening to the solemn oaths of initiation. Tolstoy has never entered a lodge himself, yet his depiction is uncannily accurate. In a Russia where real lodges are banned, Masonry finds new life on the page. Through fiction, it re-enters the imagination of readers across the empire. The fraternity may be absent in practice, but it endures in story and symbol. Although lodges closed, Masonic influence lingered in culture and literature. Tolstoy's War and Peace depicts Pierre Bezukhov's initiation in remarkable detail, showing how Masonry could inspire reflection on moral duty and spiritual growth. Architects and artists occasionally used Masonic motifs. But institutionally, there were no lodges in Russia. Gentlemen who wished to join had to do so abroad, in Paris, Berlin, or London. The state and the Orthodox Church remained hostile. Clergy denounced Freemasonry as heretical. Conservative writers portrayed it as a foreign cabal. Anti-Masonic conspiracy theories flourished, culminating in the fabricated protocols of the Elders of Zion in the early 20th century, which linked Jews and Freemasons in a mythical plot for world domination. In a back room of a St. Petersburg cafe, the year is 1910. Journalists, deputies, and professors crowd together, the air thick with smoke and argument. The lodge master rises, but instead of opening with ritual, he declares, "From tonight, we are no longer philosophers. We are citizens. The lodge will act." A murmur runs through the room, then applause. The transformation is complete. Masonry has shed its apron and gavel, becoming a forum for political change. Within a few years, many in this circle will find themselves at the heart of revolution. The Revolution of 1905 forced Nicholas II to allow limited civil freedoms. Lodges were re-established in St. Petersburg under French authority. Many members were deputies of the new Duma, liberal intellectuals and professionals. By 1910, they had reorganized themselves as the Grand Orient of the Peoples of Russia. Abandoning ritual, they concentrated on political action. When the February Revolution of 1917 overthrew the monarchy, several leading figures of the provisional government, including Alexander Kerensky, had been involved in these circles. This gave rise to the later myth of a Masonic conspiracy. In reality, the revolution had far wider causes, but the lodges had indeed served as places where reform-minded men could meet in trust. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 brought that brief revival to an end. By 1922, all lodges were suppressed once more. Fast forward to 1937, the height of the Stalinist terror. In a dim interrogation chamber, a prisoner stares at the file laid before him. On its cover is scrawled a single phrase, Masonic conspiracy. He has never seen a lodge, never worn an apron, yet the accusation is enough. Under the pressure of interrogation, he admits to absurd charges just to survive. Outside the prison walls, no lodge has existed for 20 years. Yet the fear of Masonry remains so potent that even a whisper of its name can destroy a life. For 70 years, Freemasonry was outlawed in Soviet Russia. The regime denounced it as a bourgeois conspiracy and a tool of capitalist powers. In the Stalinist purges, Masonic plots were sometimes cited in show trials as convenient accusations. Yet Masonry did not vanish entirely. Among the Russian émigrés of Paris, Berlin, and New York, lodges of exiles kept working, maintaining rituals and libraries in the Russian language. Within the Soviet Union itself, scholars studied its history in secret, and the very act of reading about Masonry became a gesture of quiet resistance. Moscow, June 24th, 1995. Candles flicker in a solemn hall as men stand in white gloves and aprons. Ancient words are spoken. In the name of the great architect of the universe, I constitute and consecrate the Grand Lodge of Russia. brethren clasp hands, eyes glisten with tears. For the first time since the 19th century, a regular Grand Lodge has been born on Russian soil. Today, that Grand Lodge is recognized around the world. It has more than 60 lodges, new charters as recent as 2024, and a modest but steady membership. After centuries of suppression, the craft in Russia has returned to the light. The collapse of the Soviet Union opened the way for a rebirth. In the early 1990s, French Freemasons sponsored new lodges in Moscow and St. Petersburg. On 24 June 1995, appropriately the Feast of St. John, the Grand Lodge of Russia was formally constituted in Moscow under the guidance of the Grande Loge Nationale Française. In 1996, it received recognition from the United Grand Lodge of England, placing it firmly within the family of regular Freemasonry. Today, the Grand Lodge of Russia is the only regular jurisdiction in the country recognized by the United Grand Lodge of England and most other Grand Lodges. It is led by Grand Master Andrei Bogdanov, and its official registry shows over 60 constituent lodges across the country, with new charters issued as recently as 2024. Public estimates suggest a membership of around 700 in 2016 and about 1,300 by 2025. Alongside the Grand Lodge of Russia, there are smaller obediences. The United Grand Lodge of Russia, founded in 2008 under the patronage of the Grand Lodge of France, follows the continental tradition and is not recognized by the United Grand Lodge of England. Mixed gender lodges also exist under international liberal obediences. But the mainstream of Russian Masonry is firmly in the Grand Lodge of Russia. Freemasonry today is legal in Russia. The Grand Lodge of Russia operates as a registered non-profit association. It keeps a deliberately low profile, avoids politics and religion, and holds only a few discrete public ceremonies each year, such as wreath-laying on Victory Day. Unlike many non-government organizations, it has not been designated a foreign agent or extremist organization. Its survival depends on precisely that cautious stance. The history of Freemasonry in Russia is one of repeated rebirths. It flourished under Catherine, only to be crushed. It rose again under Alexander, only to be banned once more. It reappeared in 1905, vanished under the Bolsheviks, and has returned again in our own time. Each cycle has left traces in Russian culture, in literature, in architecture, in the memory of conspiracies and ideals. Today's Russian Freemasons are few in number, but their continuity with those earlier generations is real. They gather quietly in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities, working the same rituals once practiced by Yelagin, Novikov, and the Decembrists. They are part of the international fraternity, recognized and respected abroad. After centuries of suspicion, suppression, and survival, the craft in Russia remains alive. Modest in scale, but rich in historical resonance. On a bright September morning in 1923, as merchants unloaded silks and sailors clustered in the narrow streets of Yokohama, the ground itself began to convulse. Stone walls cracked like eggshells, and within minutes fire leapt from collapsed kitchens, racing across the wooden city faster than men could run. Amid the devastation, one small company of Freemasons picked their way through rubble to the smouldering ruins of their temple on Yamashita-cho. The columns were toppled, the square and compasses charred, the records reduced to ash. And yet, in the cinders of that moment, the brethren resolved that their labour would not end. They would meet in warehouses, burnt-out shells, even in the bare rooms of trading houses, wherever three could gather, until charity and determination could raise again a house fit for their mysteries. From those ashes rose not only a new temple, but a parable, that Masonry in Japan would be no stranger to ruin nor to rebirth. When the first Masons unfurled their warrants in Japan, the country itself was in the throes of transformation. The Tokugawa shogunate had only recently yielded to the Meiji Restoration, and the new state was determined to learn from the West while preserving its own identity. Into this paradoxical atmosphere of ironclad tradition coexisting with telegraph wires and steamships came a fraternity whose symbols, rituals, and ideals must have seemed as exotic to Japanese eyes as the samurai's sword did to the newly arrived foreigner. In Yokohama, the treaty port carved from rice paddies in the 1850s, Masonic lodges rose amid the clapboard houses, merchant counting rooms, and consulates of the foreign settlement. Sailors in white caps, tea and silk traders, and engineers from Britain or Scotland could climb the bluff and gather by candlelight under the all-seeing eye, raising a tiled floor where only a decade earlier fishermen had mended their nets. Kobe followed in 1872 with its Rising Sun Lodge, an apt title for a port city at the forefront of Japan's sunrise into modernity. In Nagasaki, long accustomed to Dutch traders on Dashima, the Scottish Constitution granted warrant to Lodge No. 710, weaving Masonic ritual into a harbour that had already been Japan's narrow window to the west. To Japanese onlookers, these gatherings must have been baffling. Here were men of rank and nationality otherwise divided, English, Scottish, American, German, now robed in aprons and exchanging cryptic handshakes in shuttered halls. Yet those halls themselves soon became landmarks of cosmopolitan Japan. In Kobe, a Masonic hall was founded in 1871, its foundation stone laid with pomp, and by 1909 the impressive Corinthian Hall was erected as the seat of the District Grand Lodge. In an era when Western clubs and associations sprang up across the treaty ports, Freemasonry stood apart, not simply as another expatriate social club, but as a society cloaked in ritual, speaking of brotherhood and enlightenment in ways unfamiliar to Japanese civic culture. Thus, the first half-century of Masonry in Japan was both fragile and distinctive, a fraternity of foreigners, existing by the grace of treaty port extraterritoriality, flourishing in the liminal spaces where Japanese modernization and Western traditions uneasily converged. If the first lodges thrived under the protection of treaty port extraterritoriality, they did so in a country that looked upon secret meetings with deep suspicion. The Meiji state, intent on forging a modern nation, was acutely wary of anything that might rival its authority. In 1887, an imperial rescript prohibited assemblies of a secret nature. Though not aimed specifically at the craft, the decree cast a long shadow. For a fraternity that valued its privacy and symbolism, it meant that any engagement with Japanese citizens could be construed as illicit. Diplomatic channels were quietly engaged. In 1894, the US Secretary of State sought clarification, and Tokyo responded with a delicate compromise. Masonic meetings would not be interfered with, provided no Japanese nationals were admitted. This gentleman's agreement was never enshrined in statute, yet it governed practice for the next half-century. Lodges continued to thrive in Kobe, Yokohama, and Tokyo, but their membership lists read like shipping registers rather than local rolls. British merchants, Scottish engineers, American naval officers, and the occasional German consul. To Japanese onlookers, Masonry was a curiosity, neither condemned outright nor embraced, but tolerated as a peculiarity of the foreign settlements. Newspaper articles occasionally mentioned strange midnight gatherings of Europeans who marched in aprons and collars, but for the Japanese elite, the craft remained opaque. Even those few Japanese aristocrats who desired initiation had to seek it abroad. Men like Count Takeichi Hayashi, initiated in London in 1886, or Nabeshima Yotaro in 1903. At home, the tiled doors of the lodge were closed to them. This prohibition was not merely legal, but cultural. In a society where loyalty to emperor and family defined social order, the idea of swearing oaths to a universal brotherhood, using cryptic symbols and foreign ritual, was bound to provoke unease. Thus, Masonry in Japan entered the 20th century as an enclave institution, visible in its temples, known in diplomatic circles, yet curiously disconnected from the very society that surrounded it. When Tokyo American Lodge first opened under dispensation in October 1947, material was scarce. Aprons were fashioned from condemned Japanese silk parachutes salvaged from military stores. They were serviceable, save for one oversight. Someone had forgotten to attach strings. That evening, more than 150 brethren filed into the Joshi Kaiken Hall, holding their aprons awkwardly in place with elbows and forearms, while aluminium jewels, cut from scrap, caught the light. The Tyler's Register shows 102 names signed, a record not of splendour, but of stubborn fidelity. The craft could improvise, so long as it could meet. At precisely 11:58 on the 1st of September 1923, the Kanto plain heaved with a force that split roads, snapped rail lines, and toppled houses in their thousands. In Yokohama, the elegant temple of Star in the East Lodge at 61 Yamashita-cho crumbled in moments, its walls collapsing before the brethren had time to salvage even their working tools. Fires, driven by sudden gales, consumed what the quake had spared. Within hours, Yokohama was a sea of flame. In the smouldering ruins, the square encompasses lay blackened and twisted, yet the fraternity did not perish with the stone. Brethren gathered first in the shell of a trading company near Hanazonobashi, later in a warehouse on the docks, conducting meetings with what furniture and jewels they could improvise. The ritual continued under charred beams, and the Tyler's Register still bore new signatures, even if the ink was blotted by ash. For the members, these improvised assemblies were not only acts of duty, but quiet defiance against despair. Relief followed swiftly from beyond Japan's shores. The General Masonic Charity Fund of Japan distributed assistance to brethren and their families, while the United Grand Lodge of England sent 80,000 yen, a vast sum in those years, to rebuild. On 12th February 1927, the new bluff temple at number 3 Yamate-cho was dedicated. Bronze plaques fixed at its entrance proclaimed the gratitude of Japanese lodges to their English benefactors, and the building itself became a symbol of endurance. The earthquake thus became part of Masonic law in Japan, a disaster that obliterated walls but not fraternity, and a lesson in how charity, transformed into literal stone, could bind local brethren to their global kin. By the late 1930s, the optimism of the Treaty Port era had faded. Japan was mobilizing for war in China, and suspicion of secret societies grew ever more acute. Freemasonry, with its foreign lodges, closed doors, and cryptic symbolism, was an easy target for an anxious state that equated secrecy with sedition. On the 8th of December 1941, the day Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, police in Yokohama and other cities moved swiftly. The Temple of Star in the east was seized outright. Officials catalogued and confiscated everything within its walls: all lodge furniture, regalia, jewels, tools, implements, and books. Brethren were arrested, interrogated, in some cases jailed. What had been a sanctuary of fraternity was suddenly redefined as a storehouse of subversion. Yet the story is more than bureaucratic confiscation. It is also one of quiet courage. Brethren risked much to conceal fragments of lodge history. Records were hidden by devious and dangerous means in private homes or smuggled into safe hands, so that successors might know their lineage when peace returned. Such acts of preservation, though unglamorous, were as vital as any battle honour, for they carried forward the thread of memory when the craft itself seemed extinguished. The intellectual climate was equally hostile. Anti-Masonic pamphlets and conspiracy tracts, some imported from Europe, were circulated to justify the suppression. But amid the clamour, one extraordinary exception emerged: Rosan Osawa's 520-page Freemasonry that exists in Japan, 1941. Instead of vilification, Osawa attempted a balanced survey, quoting Anderson's Constitutions, Pike's Morals and Dogma, and even the bylaws of Yokohama Lodge, number 1092, and Star in the East, number 640. In an era when objective study could itself be seen as disloyal, Osawa's work was an act of intellectual integrity, quietly heroic in its own way. When the war ended, the confiscated treasures resurfaced in the most unlikely places. 4 crates of lodge records were discovered in the disused Yokohama Yacht Club. The lodge's clock was found ticking in the office of the city's chief of police. Most astonishing of all, the lodge organ, once used to swell the notes of solemn ritual, was uncovered in the private home of the police sergeant who had overseen Masonic prosecutions. One imagines the strange dissonance of its tones, once reserved for sacred labour, echoing in the sergeant's parlour as his family gathered round. Thus the wartime years stand in Japanese Masonic history as both nadir and paradox. A time when the craft was denounced as dangerous, its symbols stripped from their temples, and yet, through the resilience of individual brethren and the sheer oddities of circumstance, its material culture and its spirit endured. In the confusion of wartime confiscations, Masonic regalia and furnishings disappeared into police custody. Years later, after the occupation began, brethren set about retrieving what they could. In Yokohama, 4 crates of records were located in the abandoned yacht club. The lodge clock was found in the chief of police's office, still ticking. But the strangest discovery was the lodge organ. Once used to swell solemn hymns within tiled walls, it now sat incongruously in the parlour of the police sergeant who had overseen anti-Masonic prosecutions. The image is almost surreal. Children perhaps listening to its tones, unaware they echoed from a past their father had tried to erase. Its recovery became less a matter of property than a parable. Symbols may be confiscated, but memory has a way of playing itself back. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Masonry in Japan stirred cautiously back to life. Its first rebirth was not in solemn temples, but in makeshift clubs. The Tokyo Bay Masonic Club, formed by soldiers and civilians who had survived the war or newly arrived with the occupation. They gathered in borrowed halls, comparing scraps of memory and piecing together what was left of their craft. At first, it was less a lodge than a clearinghouse for fellowship and lost property. Reports circulated of regalia hidden in warehouses, documents resurfacing in yacht clubs, even jewels turning up in private hands. In Kobe, symbolism took on an almost cinematic irony. General Robert Eichelberger, commanding the 8th Army, granted brethren the use of the German Club Concordia, a building long associated with Nazi gatherings. "You will have the Nazi room in Kobe for your lodge meetings," his staff announced. Thus, a hall once draped in swastikas was rededicated to the square and compasses, a gesture that needed no explanation. But the most enduring vignette belongs to Tokyo in October 1947. At the Joshi Kaikan, more than 150 brethren assembled under the authority of a dispensation from Connecticut. With supplies scarce, aprons had been sewn from condemned Japanese parachutes. In the rush of preparation, someone forgot to attach strings, leaving brethren to clutch them awkwardly in place, while jewels of scrap aluminium glinted in the lamplight. The Tyler's Register bore 102 signatures that night, proof that the essence of Masonry, its form, spirit, and fellowship, did not depend on wealth of material. These early occupation stories mark the moment when Masonry in Japan transitioned from exile back into daylight. Improvised, imperfect, even faintly absurd at times, they reveal a truth as old as the craft, that the lodge exists not in its walls or trappings, but in the persistence of its members to meet on the level, wherever they may find themselves. For nearly 6 decades, the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1894 had defined Masonry in Japan as a foreign fraternity. Its temples stood within Japanese cities, yet their doors were closed to Japanese citizens. Even the few who joined had to do so abroad. Count, later Viscount, Takechi Hayashi was initiated in London in 1886, Nabeshima Yotaro in an Anglo-colonial lodge in 1903, and a handful of others followed suit. At home, however, the tiled threshold remained forbidden ground. That barrier fell in the immediate aftermath of war. The occupation had stripped away much of Japan's pre-war authoritarianism, and with it the suspicion that had kept Masonic rituals quarantined as secret societies. Inquiries to Tokyo revealed that no legal statute explicitly forbade membership. The old prohibition, it turned out, was remembered more by foreign diplomats than by Japanese officials. Into this uncertain opening stepped Naotake Sato, then president of the House of Councillors and a respected diplomat. In a carefully worded petition to General Douglas MacArthur, he and others requested permission and blessings that we may join the Masonic order. The letter emphasized that the moral instruction given by Major Michael Rivistow of the occupation forces had won over our hearts. It was, in tone, both dignified and deferential, an appeal framed within Japan's new democratic ethos, yet still couched in the etiquette of supplication to authority. The response was favorable. For the first time, Japanese candidates were initiated not abroad, but in their own country. The symbolism was immense. What had long been a fraternity of expatriates confined to the treaty ports and their foreign settlements now became something in which Japanese men of rank and responsibility could freely participate. This moment marked the true indigenization of the craft in Japan, a pivot from foreign enclave to national fraternity. In the ruins of post-war Kobe, brethren sought a place to meet. The answer came, ironically, from the 8th Army Commander, General Robert Eichelberger. He authorized them to use the German club Concordia, once a gathering place for local Nazis. "You will have the Nazi room in Kobe for your lodge meetings," his staff declared. The irony was delicious. A hall once filled with banners of hate was rededicated to a fraternity devoted to brotherhood. Every meeting there carried a quiet sense of poetic justice, as if the square and compasses themselves had conquered by occupation what arms had defeated in war. The immediate post-war years were a time of improvisation. Parachute aprons, regalia of scrap aluminium, lodges meeting in borrowed halls. But within 2 years, order began to return, and the question arose, under whose jurisdiction would Masonry in Japan be properly constituted? The earliest post-war dispensation, Tokyo American Lodge, under Connecticut, proved short-lived. Renewed in 1948, but never granted a charter, it lapsed in 1949. Yet its existence pointed to a deeper need. The scattered clubs of American servicemen and expatriates could not thrive indefinitely without the structure of a Grand Lodge. That framework came from the Philippines. The Grand Lodge in Manila, itself forged out of American and Filipino cooperation earlier in the century, was uniquely positioned to guide Japan's revival. Beginning in 1947, it issued charters for a series of new lodges. Yokosuka Naval Lodge No. 120, Far East No. 124 in Yokohama, Tokyo No. 125, Square and Compass, No. 126 in Tachikawa, and Kyushu No. 127 in Kokura. Each lodge bore the hallmarks of its founding constituency: naval personnel, occupation officials, expatriate civilians. But together they began to stitch a network across the Japanese archipelago. As the 1950s unfolded, these lodges matured. Japanese candidates were now being initiated alongside Americans and Britons. The ritual itself translated into Japanese for the first time. In 1954, Manila established a District Grand Lodge of Japan, a clear sign that the craft here had moved beyond emergency measures and was preparing for autonomy. The decisive moment came in early 1957. 15 lodges convened in convention, voted for independence, elected officers, and dispatched a delegation to Manila's annual communication. There, recognition was granted. The Grand Lodge of Japan was consecrated that same year, a sovereign body at last. In less than a decade, Masonry in Japan had travelled from a warehouse lit by scavenged lamps to a full Grand Lodge, its warrants issued in Japanese cities rather than foreign chancelleries. For men who had clutched parachute aprons to their waists in 1947, the founding of a Grand Lodge in 1957 must have felt like the culmination of a pilgrimage. Proof that the craft, once merely tolerated in treaty ports, had taken root in Japanese soil. Institutions may define Masonry, but its vitality is measured in the lives of individual brethren. The post-war years in Japan produced moments at once poignant and extraordinary, which deserve to be remembered as much as constitutions or warrants. In 1946, Starr in the East Lodge conferred honorary membership upon General Douglas MacArthur and General Robert Eichelberger by acclamation, an act that testified to gratitude as much as ceremony. A few months later, Australian Commander General Horace Robertson was similarly honoured. The gesture was symbolic. Men who had overseen war and occupation now acknowledged in the roles of fraternity, a bridge between conquerors and the conquered laid upon the square. The minute book from April 1946, recording the first regular meeting after 4 years and 5 months, conveys its emotion in restrained prose. Brethren noted that their trials and sufferings, while in jail, had been almost beyond human endurance. That phrase, spare, unadorned, testifies more eloquently than rhetoric to the ordeal of war. Yet in the same meeting, candidates were initiated, proving that even grief could be folded into continuity. Other entries capture the quiet urgency of renewal. Emergency meetings called to initiate any 7 applicants, 1 Minute records. Such words suggest not disorder, but appetite. Men hungry for the fellowship and stability Masonry offered in a time of upheaval. Beyond generals and dignitaries, it was the persistence of ordinary brethren that ensured survival. Men who risked concealing lodge records, who scrounged for tools and jewels, who borrowed halls and stitched aprons, performed acts of memory as significant as any ritual. They remind us that the craft is never solely defined by buildings or numbers, but by the tenacity of individuals to preserve its light through the darkest seasons. The appetite for fraternity after the war was so intense that minutes of Starr in the East Lodge record an unusual phrase. Emergency meetings to initiate any 7 applicants. The number 7 may have been the administrative shorthand, but the image it conjures is powerful. Imagine, in a city still charred by earthquake and war, men pressing forward to join an order they had once been forbidden even to approach. To the brethren, each new initiation was more than ceremony. It was the steady proof that Masonry in Japan was not merely being rebuilt, it was being reborn, candidate by candidate, obligation by obligation. With the consecration of the Grand Lodge of Japan in 1957, the craft stepped out of its long provisional phase and into sovereignty. For the first time, warrants bore the names of Japanese cities rather than foreign chancelleries, and ritual, already translated into Japanese, was being worked by native brethren alongside expatriates. Growth came quickly. By the early 1970s, membership had reached its peak. Nearly 4,800 men spread across roughly 20 lodges. The numbers, though modest by global standards, were remarkable given the context. A fraternity once confined to treaty port enclaves had, within a generation, become a national body with its own officers, traditions, and rhythm of labour. Yet the character of membership remained mixed. American servicemen stationed in Japan during the Cold War years formed a substantial portion of lodge rolls, joined by businessmen and engineers from abroad. Increasingly, however, Japanese professionals, parliamentarians, jurists, physicians, and scholars took their places in the East and West. Their presence shifted the tenor of Masonry from an expatriate association into something recognisably integrated with Japanese civic life. The broader setting also mattered. These were the years of Japan's economic miracle, when factories multiplied, neon towers rose, and the country reimagined itself as a modern democracy. In such an atmosphere, voluntary associations flourished, professional societies, alumni networks, and service clubs like Rotary. Masonry, once tolerated as a foreign curiosity, now fit more naturally within this expanding civil society. To join the craft in the 1960s was no longer to risk suspicion, but to claim a place within a cosmopolitan fraternity that promised both moral instruction and social fellowship. By the late 1970s, the initial surge slowed, mirroring trends across the Masonic world. Yet the achievement remained profound. Within 20 years, the fraternity had gone from parachute aprons and improvised jewels to a Grand Lodge recognized internationally, peopled by both foreign and Japanese brethren, and solidly anchored in the civic landscape of modern Japan. From the Treaty Port Lodges to the Grand Lodge of Japan, Freemasonry on the archipelago has journeyed through calamity, suppression, and rebirth to become a venerable institution, now firmly planted in modern soil. Today, the craft meets in the Tokyo Masonic Center, a modest-seeming two-story building that belies its historical pedigree. It stands on land once belonging to the Hisamatsu family, ancient retainers of Tokugawa Ieyasu, and was shaped from the former Naval Officers Club into a foundation-owned Masonic home through the charitable cooperation of Scottish Rite bodies and the Tokyo Masonic Association. Each spring, the Grand Lodge gathers not only Masons but children and families at its annual Children's Festival, a gesture of fraternity that resonates far beyond the ritual lodge room. In March 2025, over 300 brethren and guests from more than 20 countries gathered beneath spring blossoms at ANCOM, symbolizing the Grand Lodge's vibrant international presence. Meanwhile, the Tokyo Masonic Center is undergoing reconstruction, a timely reminder that renewal is built into Masonic architecture as it is into its story. Yet beneath the stones and programming lies a fraternity that continues its centuries-old task, stitching universal ideals, brotherly love, relief, and truth into a living local tradition. The Grand Lodge of Japan now stands in amity with over 150 other jurisdictions worldwide, and Masonry here is no longer a foreign curiosity, but a civic legacy tempered by history and shaped by Japanese hands. As you reflect on this journey through quakes, war, exclusion, and resurrection, ask yourselves, what does it mean when an institution founded by outsiders becomes part of the national fabric? How do rituals transplanted from elsewhere take root in a different cultural soil? And what lessons ought we draw when values endure, even as temple doors tumble, records vanish, or buildings lie in ruins? In Japan, the craft has answered these questions not by retreating into the past, but by building forward, just as Masons have always done, square by square. The history of Freemasonry in Ireland, though less frequently rehearsed than that of her sister constitutions in England or Scotland, is nevertheless rich in antiquity and fertile in significance. From the earliest days, when the civic and mercantile life of Dublin was interwoven with the traditions of English settlers, down to the full maturity of the 18th century, when a Grand Lodge was formally constituted, there are discernible signs of a continuous development, wherein operative usages gradually gave place to speculative ideals. These traces, at first faint and scattered, the ceremonies of the guilds, the inscriptions upon ancient monuments, the laughter of the uninitiated at rites they but half understood, and the quiet gatherings of brethren in rural retreats, collectively attest that the soil of Ireland was already prepared to receive the organised system of Masonry before ever the London experiment of 1717 had been conceived. It is therefore fitting to turn our attention to those early manifestations which, though humble in appearance, are yet of profound moment to the student of the craft in Ireland. It is a matter deserving of more than passing remark that the guilds of Dublin, those ancient fraternities of trade and craft, should have continued even so late as the year 1541. It is a matter deserving of more than passing remark that the guilds of Dublin, those ancient fraternities of trade and craft, should have continued even so late as the year 1541 to perform their annual Corpus Christi plays. In these pageants, which had their parallels in York, Coventry, and Chester, the civic community was bound together in common devotion, each guild assuming its appointed portion in the unfolding of the sacred drama. The Masons, no less than the Weavers or the Mariners, were seen to participate in this liturgical theatre, and in their solemn impersonations we may discern a prelude to that allegorical teaching which in later days was to form the peculiar province of the Freemason. What had begun as the external expression of religious duty was insensibly transmuted into a symbolic language, a foreshadowing of those moral dramas which were destined to occupy the speculative lodges of the 18th century. That the term Freemason itself had entered into the consciousness of the Irish people by the early 17th century is attested in no uncertain fashion by the celebrated Bowles Bridge Square, discovered in Limerick in 1830, but bearing the date 1507 upon its face. Whether we accept this as a genuine relic of the early Tudor period, or ascribe it to somewhat later years of the Stuart monarchy, matters little to its essential testimony, for engraved upon it, in words of singular simplicity, is the injunction, "I will strive to live with love and care upon the level by the square." Here, in a single artifact, is preserved both the language and the ethos of our craft, standing as a mute witness that long before the constitution of any Grand Lodge, the ideals of Masonry were already known, cherished, and commemorated upon Irish soil. By the year 1688, these usages had attained such notoriety that they could serve as the butt of collegiate jest. In that year, an oration delivered in Trinity College, commonly known as the Trinity Tripos, did not scruple to parody the ceremonies of the Freemasons, presenting them for the amusement of the academic youth of Dublin. To be thus ridiculed was, paradoxically, to be acknowledged, for satire feeds only upon what is familiar. The fact that the ritual of Masonry could be recognized and mocked by an audience beyond the lodge is proof that the craft was already an institution sufficiently coherent to provoke both curiosity and laughter, a testimony, unintended yet invaluable, to its established presence in Ireland prior to the dawn of the 18th century. Nor should we omit the testimony, shadowy yet persuasive, that speculative lodges, composed of gentlemen and men of letters, rather than of operative builders, were established in the countryside of Ireland before the accession of George I. That they existed remote from any town is a circumstance of peculiar interest, for it suggests that the speculative genius of Masonry in Ireland was not merely an urban importation, but a growth indigenous to the land itself, springing up even in secluded rural districts. In these hidden assemblies, long before the Brethren of London and Westminster formed their celebrated Federation of 1717, Irish Masons were already cultivating the principles of brotherhood, morality, and enlightenment that were to become the hallmarks of the modern fraternity. Thus, by a combination of liturgical drama, inscribed monument, satirical lampoon, and rustic lodge, we trace the gradual but unmistakable emergence of Freemasonry in Ireland, standing ready when the hour should come to clothe itself in the more formal vesture of Grand Lodge authority. It is impossible to say, in default of early official manuscript records, the exact date at which a Grand Lodge was first established in Dublin. That such a body was in existence in 1725 is certain, thanks to a long and curious account given in a Dublin newspaper. From this, we learn that about 100 brethren belonging to the 6 lodges of gentlemen Freemasons who are under the jurisdiction of the Grand Master, assembled at 11 a.m. on June 24th at the Yellow Lion in Verburg Street, and proceeded in coaches to the King's Inns, wearing aprons, white gloves, and other parts of the distinguishing dress of that worshipful order. After a procession round the great hall of the inns with many important ceremonies, the Grand Lodge retired to the room prepared for them, where after performing the mystical ceremonies of the Grand Lodge, which are held so sacred that they must not be discovered to a private brother, they proceeded to the election of a new Grand Master, etc. The election resulted in the Earl of Ross being declared Grand Master, Sir Thomas Prendergast and Mark Morgan, Esquire, Grand Wardens, and the Grand Master was pleased to appoint Humphrey Butler, Esquire, his deputy. The Grand Master was then conducted to his place and invested with the jewel of his office, a gold trowel hung on a black ribbon. Afterwards, the brethren all dined together sumptuously, and later attended a play in full Masonic costume. This is the earliest account we have of the meeting of Grand Lodge in Dublin, and though apparently it had then been in existence for some time, it cannot have contemplated any authority over lodges remote from the metropolis, because, in the following year, a similar body was established in Cork City, and assumed the style of the Grand Lodge of Munster, having as its Grand Master the Honourable James O'Brien, and as Deputy Grand Master Springett Penn. Both these Masons were members of English lodges, but a more famous Irish Freemason of the day, who also had received his degrees in an English lodge, was James, 4th Lord Kingston. In 1728 he had been elected and served as Grand Master of England, and in 1730 became Grand Master of Ireland, and in August 1731 Grand Master of Munster. His tenure of the dual office in Ireland apparently led to the fusion of the 2 Grand Lodges into one that since that date has been truly national. Lord Kingston's tenancy of these 3 chairs in Masonry is important, as showing that at this date the ritual innovations that afterwards led to estrangement between the Masonic jurisdictions of England and Ireland cannot yet have come into being. His tenures of office should also serve to remind Irish Masons that while the existent Irish rite is probably the most unaltered version extant of early 18th century Masonic ritual, yet its wellhead was no other than the primitive English rite as practised before 1730, possibly with a few additions of Anglo-Irish phrases or ceremonies, distinctions without any real difference. At some time during 1731, the Grand Lodge of Ireland determined to bind closer to the central authority all the lodges in Ireland that would acknowledge its supremacy, by issuing to them a document that should be the warrant for their Masonic proceedings, and accordingly, on February 7, 1732, the first of these authorizations to hold a lodge and make Masons were issued. This was a purely Irish invention that was copied later by the Grand Lodge of the Antiants in England, and later still by the Grand Lodge of the Moderns, the title willingly assumed in the 18th century by the mother of all Grand Lodges. It is by no means certain that every existing lodge in Ireland applied at once for one of these new warrants. In fact, the evidence tends to show that a good many, particularly in remote parts of the country, were content to go on working in the time immemorial manner. But these recalcitrants were not treated as regular Masons by those who adhered to the Grand Lodge, and in time they died out. The effect produced by the issue of these warrants was universal, not merely local. It was some time before the law crystallized that a warrant should be anchored to one place, and at first the idea prevailed that any band of Masons possessing one of these charters was legally entitled to make initiates wherever it took the warrant. This procedure was checked by a new law made June 24, 1741, but in the beginning the Grand Lodge seems tacitly to have assented to the practice, particularly as it had issued warrants as early as 1732 to military lodges, enabling them to hold regular meetings all over the inhabitable globe. The great spread of Masonry in the American colonies is attributable in a great part, no doubt, to this practice. But the influence of the Grand Lodge of Ireland on America did not end with this. The fact that the Native American lodges would naturally be impressed by the working they observed under the ambulatory Irish warrants. During a period when the only ambulatory warrants were Irish, led them to mistrust those alterations in the ritual that the Grand Lodge of the Moderns saw fit to adopt for well nigh 80 years. The enormous emigration from Ireland to America during the 18th century also helped to cement the Masonic ties between the two countries. Indeed, it is quite likely that some of the earliest Irish warrants, whose original bailiwicks and ultimate resting places are unknown, may have helped to lay the foundations of those great Masonic constitutions, whose extent and vitality seem so marvellous to us today. It was the Irish genius for orderly government that first clothed the peripatetic habits of soldiers and craftsmen with a juridical garment, the warrant. In February 1732, the Grand Lodge of Ireland began issuing written authorities to hold lodges. Almost immediately, these were granted to military units, and, crucially, they were treated as ambulatory, so that any band of Masons possessing one of these charters was legally entitled to make initiates wherever it took the warrant. This freedom was only curtailed by a new law of 24th June 1741, requiring warrants to be anchored to a specific place. The ramifications were immense. Irish-issued travelling warrants enabled regular meetings across the inhabitable globe, and they strongly conditioned colonial Masonry, most conspicuously in British North America, where exposure to Irish ritual inclined many brethren to mistrust the later innovations adopted by the so-called moderns in London. The spread of Masonry in the American colonies can be attributed in no small measure to this practice, and the story of the craft's globalization thus has, at its practical core, a distinctly Irish invention. From the outset, Irish military warrants did not merely travel, they seeded institutions. the roll of early Irish travelling lodges includes the first military warrant of 7th November 1732 to the 1st Battalion, Royal Scots, and, a generation later, lodges whose activities shaped American Grand Lodge formation. The Glittering Star Lodge number 322, attached to the 29th Regiment of Foot, is credited in its own contemporary records with helping to inaugurate the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, Ancients, at Boston on the 27th of December 1769, a thread that ties Irish working directly to one of the great American constitutions. Even the Genesis narrative of Prince Hall Freemasonry turns, in institutional memory, on an Irish warranted regimental lodge, number 441, attached to the 38th Regiment of Foot, initiating Prince Hall and 14 others at Castle William, Boston Harbour, on the 6th of March, 1775. In these cases alike, the warrant behaves precisely as designed, a portable charter bearing Irish ritual into new soils. The same pattern is unmistakable south of the equator. The Lodge of Social and Military Virtues, number 227 under the Irish Constitution, attached to the 46th South Devonshire Regiment, is repeatedly singled out for its activity at Sydney in 1816, including the public laying of a foundation stone on the 2nd of November of that year and its catalytic role in the emergence of stationary colonial lodges under Irish authority. These included the Australian Social Lodge, number 260, warranted in 1820, and the Leinster Lodge, number 266, warranted in 1824, both of which preceded the appearance of English warrants later in the decade. Whether one emphasises the lodge's first public ceremony or its institutional consequences, the Irish travelling warrant again appears as the enabling mechanism by which formal Masonry passed from a garrison culture to a settled colonial footing. Nor is this merely antiquarian. 2 Irish warranted military lodges remain active as living memorials of the 18th century system. St. Patrick's Lodge, number 295, attached to what is today the Royal Dragoon Guards, and Glittering Star Lodge, number 322, now associated with the Mercian Regiment. Their continued working, alongside a long Irish record in Canada, the West Indies, Portugal, Peru, Brazil, Australasia, India, and Africa, illustrates how a small jurisdiction exercised an influence out of all proportion to the home territory it governed, and how Dublin habitually welcomed the orderly transfer of its daughter lodges to new sovereign grand lodges as they arose. In short, the Irish travelling warrant was not only an instrument of expansion, but also a grammar of legitimacy, through which the craft replicated itself across continents while preserving regular relations with the mother constitution. If we are to measure the growth of the Grand Lodge of Ireland during the 18th century by the number of warrants it issued, we find that it increased from 36 lodges in 1734 to 195 in June 1749. By 1758, the number had risen to 300. By the end of 1782, it was 610. And in 1804, when Downes's famous list was published, the Grand Lodge of Ireland had well over 700 lodges on its roll. But at none of these periods could those numbers be taken au pied de la lettre, for there were always some lodges either moribund or dormant, as an analysis of the lists would show, did space permit. During the 19th century, the number of lodges varied, the high water mark being reached in 1815, when 1,020 subordinate lodges were in official existence. The number at present working approaches 600. The members of the Grand Lodge at its formation consisted of the Grand Master, his deputy, whom he nominated, the Grand Wardens, elected by Grand Lodge, all past Grand Officers, and all Masters and Wardens of subordinate lodges. In 1749, the Grand Master's Lodge was formed, and all Master Masons raised therein were given the privilege of sitting and voting in Grand Lodge. This privilege continued down to 1837, when it was rescinded and extended instead to all properly certificated past masters. The number of the Grand Officers has been increased from time to time, and at present includes the representatives of all foreign Grand Lodges with whom fraternal communication exists, an excellent tribute paid to the universality of the craft, and a constant reminder that our Masonic duties and interests are not bounded by the limits of any one particular constitution. Space does not permit the inclusion of much detail about such important matters as the development of the Irish Masonic charitable organizations and the evolution of Masonic jurisprudence. But both must be mentioned. In regard to the former, it will be enough to say that the first successful attempt to deal on an adequate scale by the children of deceased brethren dates from 1792. In that year, the liberality and energy of some members of Royal Arch Lodge No. 190, Dublin, launched the Masonic Female Orphan School, whose record since then has been one of increasing success and blessing. It has been followed by the Masonic Orphan Boys' School, 1867, and by such splendidly administered pieces of provincial emulation as the Belfast Masonic Charity and Widows' Funds, and the Down Masonic Widows' Fund. In the matter of the evolution of Masonic jurisprudence, the most interesting development took place as early as 1768, when the Grand Lodge created an inspection committee to decide upon the eligibility of candidates for Freemasonry in the Metropolitan District. Since that year, no man has been initiated in a Dublin lodge till his name has been approved by the Grand Lodge Committee, and the same provision has since been adopted in other important Masonic provinces in Ireland. This is, of course, not an infallible method of securing the admission of none but worthy men, but it does tend to exclude undesirable members, and is yet another way in which the Grand Lodge of Ireland has set a good example. Other minutiae of changes that have accumulated during almost, perhaps quite, 2 centuries of government, while they would loom largely in a complete history, must be discarded in a short sketch. But mention should be made that since 1829 the Royal Arch degree has had a central governing body of its own, known as the Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Ireland. Since 1836, the Knights Templar have been ruled by a supreme body now known as the Grand Preceptory, and since 1826, the Supreme Council of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite has exercised jurisdiction over all degrees in its system superior to the craft degrees. Prior to these respective dates, those orders, and many other Masonic degrees as well, were conferred in the craft lodges at the convenience and free will of the members. During its long life, the authority of the Grand Lodge of Ireland has only once been seriously threatened by internal schism. This took place in the period 1806 to 1813, when a number of Ulster lodges, deceived by the misrepresentations of Alexander Seton, a former Deputy Grand Secretary who had been dismissed from his office for misconduct, attempted to secede and form a Grand Lodge for the province of Ulster. It was due entirely to the tact and disinterested efforts of the reigning Grand Master, Richard, 2nd Earl of Donomore, that the better class Masons who supported the movement at the outset, because of certain undoubted grievances, returned to their natural allegiance within a very short time, while those who persisted in following Seton only involved themselves and their lodges in disrepute, not merely at home, but also all over the Masonic world. The Grand Lodge of Ireland emerged from a severe internecine war, if not stronger in numbers, stronger in having vindicated its authority without compromising its dignity, and within a few years all the rebel lodges had either submitted or become extinct, or, if they continued to drag out an estranged existence, were regarded with abhorrence as clandestine Masons. To the student of this unhappy event, one thing stands out enshrined: the truly Masonic spirit of the Grand Master, a broad-minded, warm-hearted man who thoroughly deserved the tribute addressed to him by his Irish brethren, when, in 1813, he retired from office. At his own request, "Your Lordship's services to this institution will long live in the grateful remembrance of a society whose principles ensure its duration, and who will ever rank the name of Don O'More among those that are dearest to Masonry and Ireland." That these words were no mere empty compliment was shown exactly 100 years later, when 2,000 Irish Masons assembled in Grand Lodge to acclaim as their new Grand Master, another Earl of Donogemore, who since then has amply proved that he has inherited not the honours and name only, but also the ability of his great ancestor to maintain the dignity of his office and be a trusted and beloved leader in time of stress. The influence of the Grand Lodge of Ireland on new, independent Masonic constitutions has been large, out of all proportion to the home territory it governs, a fact that has never, in default of an official history, been adequately realised by the craft generally. Allusion has already been made to its work in the USA. In Canada, too, Irish lodges were early at work, as well as in the British West Indies. Masons in Portugal, Peru, Brazil have worn our colours. The very first lodge held in Australia met under an Irish warrant number, 227, held in the old 46th Regiment. And in that Commonwealth, as well as in New Zealand, Africa and India, some lodges still retain their allegiance to the old Irish constitution. Let me add that the Grand Lodge of Ireland never places any obstacle in the way of one of its lodges wishing to sever connection with the mother constitution to join a newly formed Grand Lodge in the country where it is situated, and provided the new constitution conform to the ancient standards, it is assured of immediate recognition and brotherly cooperation from the Grand Lodge of Ireland, which is swift to welcome the appearance of a new star in the banner of the Masonic Federation of the world. Throughout a history of 2 centuries, it is but to be expected that the Grand Lodge of Ireland should be able to show with pride many distinguished names on her rolls. But of all on the list, possibly none exerted more lasting effect upon the Freemasonry of his generation, aye, and of future generations, than that stickler for orthodoxy in matters of the craft, the inspired journeyman painter, Lawrence Dermott. His story has been well and fully told by divers scholars, but no reference to the Irish Grand Lodge would be complete without mention of the brother who was initiated in Lodge No. 26 in 1740, became its master in 1746, and departed to England to become the most notable figure in 18th century Masonry as poet, controversialist, and restorer of the old landmarks, to say nothing of his being the inventor of a term, which I understand to be very bad Hebrew, Ahiman Rezon, which like a javelin of flame flew from him with such impetus as even to cross the Atlantic and to be adopted for long enough as a symbol by those who prided themselves upon preserving the old traditions of the craft. Lawrence Dermott is the more noteworthy because the Grand Lodge of Ireland has not produced a great number of historians or writers who have added to our knowledge. Valency and O'Brien of the Round Towers, however, are still occasionally quoted by those who have never learned caution, and there have been several deservedly respected names in our own times. Some like Twiss, John Robinson, Tate, and Redfern Kelly are still with us. Others, alas, are no longer here to teach us, such as F.C. Crossall, Westrop, and the master mason of them all, the late Doctor Chetwode Crawley, sometime Grand Treasurer, a scholar so meticulous, whose work was so comprehensive that those who come after him, seeking to pursue some line of research, often find themselves only ploughing a furrow that has already been broken by his industry. That there is still something to be added to the work he accomplished is merely another way of saying that the progress of knowledge never stands still, but his followers and emulators may well despair of ever hoping to surmount his total of achievement. It may have been some satisfaction to his last years to see the formation in Dublin of the Lodge of Research, number 200, pledged to continue the labours wherein he took such an interest, and though it may seem too much to hope that this body will ever produce another scholar to compare with the one that is gone, still it has already proved a focusing point for those Masons who bend their energies towards finding more light for the present from the lessons of the past. With no mean aim, this lodge contemplates, indeed the project is in process of realization, the compiling of a reliable history of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, a book that is badly needed, never having been attempted, and I hope that the present short and imperfect sketch has shown that the history of that Grand Lodge has not been without interest, as assuredly it has not been without honour. Over the course of the past century, the Grand Lodge of Ireland has borne steady witness to the continuity of the craft, preserving with quiet dignity the institutions so carefully described by Lepper in 1925, while also adapting to the demands of a new world. Its line of Grand Masters has ensured a measured transition from the post-war era through the latter decades of the 20th century, each stewarding the order with an awareness of its ancient heritage and an eye to the needs of contemporary brethren. The network of Irish lodges has remained truly international in scope, stretching across 13 provinces at home and extending to Bermuda, the Caribbean, Africa, India, and Australasia, thereby maintaining the global character that travelling warrants first imparted to the Constitution. In Dublin, the headquarters on Molesworth Street has become not merely an administrative centre, but a public face of the craft, housing a library, museum, and archive that now welcome visitors and testify to the Order's willingness to share its story. In Belfast, the careful conservation of Arthur's Square has secured another historic foundation for future generations. The charitable mission of Irish Masonry, long a source of pride, has in recent decades been strengthened through the establishment of consolidated funds and housing projects, while its spiritual and social life has continued in spite of the challenges of war, sectarian attack, fire, and even the long suspensions of the recent pandemic. Today, with some 19,000 members worldwide, the Grand Lodge of Ireland still holds firmly to the ancient landmarks, while also affirming its place within a global Masonic fraternity recognised by England, Scotland, and the wider family of regular jurisdictions. As the tercentenary of 1725 to 2025 is now at hand, the Brethren prepare to celebrate not only the long life of their institution, but also the promise of its future. The planned commemorations in Dublin, from the Thanksgiving service at St. Patrick's Cathedral to the Great Communication in the Royal Convention Centre, will serve both as a tribute to the labours of the past 3 centuries and as a confident declaration that Irish Freemasonry stands ready to move forward with the same spirit of fidelity, charity, and brotherhood that has guided it since its earliest days. Freemasonry in Sweden possesses a rich and intricate history, deeply influenced by the esoteric traditions of France and Germany, as well as the spiritual currents of Rosicrucianism, Christian mysticism, and Kabbalah. Unlike many other Masonic systems, the Swedish Rite has evolved into a highly structured and distinctly Christian tradition, shaped by noble patronage and royal oversight. From its earliest beginnings in the 18th century to its formal consolidation under King Carl XIII, Swedish Freemasonry has undergone significant transformations, forging a path that differs markedly from its Anglo-American counterparts. This account explores the origins, evolution, and structure of the Swedish Rite, shedding light on the historical forces that have defined its unique character. Freemasonry in Sweden, and the Swedish Rite as a whole, possesses a complex and multifaceted history, with influences from France, Germany, Rosicrucianism, Christian mysticism, and Kabbalah. Tracing the exact development of the Rite and its distinctive practices is no simple task. The introduction of Freemasonry into Sweden is attributed to Count Axel Redespar. Having spent time in France, he was initiated, passed, and raised as a Mason, most likely within a Jacobite lodge. This early connection to France is of particular significance. Upon his return, he established the first Masonic lodge on Swedish soil on March 17, 1735. This lodge was situated in Stockholm, housed within Stenbockska palatset, a name that translates literally as the Palace of the Ibex, though in English it is more appropriately rendered as the Stenbockian Palace. The name does not, in fact, refer to an actual ibex, but rather derives from the Swedish words sten, stone, and bock, goat, which together form the noble surname Stenbock. However, that is merely a linguistic aside. This first Swedish lodge was named Grev Vredesparas Lodge, in English, the Lodge of Count Redspara, and initially worked within the St. John's degrees. The lodge was supported by other Swedish nobles who had received their degrees abroad, likely in France, though precise details remain uncertain. At this early stage, France held jurisdiction over Masonic activity in Sweden, as there was not yet an independent Grand Lodge. This arrangement was reflective of the era's broader historical and Masonic context, facilitated largely by the Swedish nobleman Carl Fredrik Schäffer. Holding the Swedish title Friherre, equivalent to Baron in English, Schäffer obtained the authority to establish lodges internationally under the governance of the French Grand Lodge. During this period, Swedish Freemasons primarily conversed in French, which functioned as the lingua franca of European nobility. It was an era of transformation in Swedish Masonry, as it evolved from an undefined system into a more structured organization. This shift was largely influenced by King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden, who, recognizing Freemasonry as a noble art, sought direct involvement. He assumed the role of High Protector of Swedish Freemasonry, with Carl Fredrik Schäffer serving as Grand Master. However, it is important to note that this was prior to the formal establishment of the Swedish Rite. The genesis of the Swedish Rite is attributed to Carl Friedrich Eklöf, who, in 1756, established Sweden's first St. Andrew's Lodge, also known as a Scottish Lodge. This lodge, named l'Innocent, regrettably no longer exists. The St. Andrew's Lodge played a pivotal role in shaping the high-degree system of the Swedish Rite. Initially, it was a loosely organized structure comprising 3 degrees, clearly influenced by the Jacobite Masons in France, who were also responsible for the development of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite and the rectified Scottish Rite. The latter of these likely bore the strongest resemblance to the Swedish system due to its association with the rite of strict observance, a topic that will be revisited later. At the time, the Order of St. Andrew was not widely regarded as a natural progression from the St. John's degrees, which were the foundation of Swedish Masonry. Matters grew more convoluted later when elements of the rite of strict observance were incorporated into its degree structure. This move further fragmented Swedish Masonry, as there were now 2 distinct high-degree systems, neither of which maintained clear ties to the St. John's lodges. Unlike in Anglo-American Freemasonry, where independent high-degree systems are commonplace, 18th century Swedish Masons found this lack of cohesion unsatisfactory. Despite these challenges, Carl Friedrich Eklöf remains widely regarded as the father of the Swedish Rite, a legacy commemorated by Sweden's premier research lodge, which bears his name. Meanwhile, the tradition of royal patronage persisted. A critical turning point came when the 3 Swedish princes, Karl, Fredrik Adolf, and Gustav, were initiated into Freemasonry. 2 of these princes would later ascend to the throne as King Gustav III and King Karl XIII. The latter devoted much of his life to the reformation of Swedish Freemasonry, unifying its disparate systems into a single, cohesive order. He succeeded Carl Fredrik Schäffer as Grand Master of Sweden and began the process of merging the various Masonic bodies into a unified structure, recognizing that the disadvantages of fragmentation outweighed any perceived benefits. This marked the beginning of a new era in Swedish Freemasonry. The unification process necessitated significant changes to the St. John's degrees, as the newly integrated High Chapter, based on the rite of strict observance, was explicitly Christian. The prince sought to ensure that all initiates of the first degree would have the opportunity to progress through the entire degree system. This objective was incompatible with a deistic form of Freemasonry. Consequently, the early degrees of Swedish Masonry were Christianized to align with the later degrees of the Rite. This adaptation was not controversial at the time, as Sweden was a Lutheran state, where membership in the Church of Sweden was compulsory until the 18th century, year 2000. Today, while affiliation with the Church of Sweden is no longer mandatory, Swedish Rite Freemasonry remains open only to Trinitarian Christians. A particularly unusual episode occurred when Duke Karl, the future King Karl XIII, became Grand Master of the Rite of strict observance. For a brief period, he simultaneously led 2 separate Masonic systems. However, by this time, the rite of strict observance was in decline, and given Karl's ongoing Masonic reforms, he ultimately incorporated its remnants into the evolving Swedish system. This resulted in a highly structured 11-degree system, distinct in its ability to guide initiates along a continuous path toward enlightenment without requiring membership in an external high-degree body. The influence of the rite of strict observance remains evident, even from the first degree, though naturally its specific elements remain esoteric. The rite originally divided Europe into Masonic provinces, with Scandinavia and Finland forming a single district. To this day, Swedish Rite Masons often refer to themselves as members of the 9th province, a vestige of this historical structure. One of the Swedish Rite's greatest strengths lies in its narrative continuity across all degrees, wherein symbols and teachings encountered in the early degrees only reveal their deeper meanings as the Mason progresses. By 1800, Duke Karl had completed the reformation of Swedish Freemasonry, revising every ritual text with the assistance of his associates and even his wife. The Swedish Rite, virtually unchanged since its finalization, remains in use today. Due to historical unions between Sweden and Norway, the rite is practiced in Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Finland. In Germany, a distinct Eklef variant persists under the Grand Landlodge of the Freemasons of Germany, Große Landesloge der Freimaurer von Deutschland, though it differs significantly from the modern Swedish rite. A defining characteristic of the Swedish Rite is its continuous progression beyond the 3rd degree. Unlike in most Masonic traditions, being raised is not the ultimate goal. Instead, the system is designed to guide every brother toward the 10th degree, with the 11th degree serving a role analogous to the 33rd degree of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, reserved for an elite few. Among Sweden's 15,000 Freemasons, fewer than 100 hold this distinction at any one time, an exclusive honour indeed. Entered apprentice, Lärling, Lodge of St. John, similar to the Blue Lodge. Fellow Craft, Medbroder, Lodge of St. John, similar to the Blue Lodge. Master Mason, Mastara, Lodge of St. John, similar to the Blue Lodge. Very Worshipful Apprentice and Fellow of St. Andrew, Lärlinger Medbroder, 4th and 5th double degree, Lodge of St. Andrew, similar to the Scottish Rite. Illustrious Scottish Master of St. Andrew, Mestere Sex, Lodge of St. Andrew, similar to the Scottish Rite. Very Illustrious Brother, Knight of the East, Riddare of Öster, 7th, Chapter, part of the Old Strict Observance. Most Illustrious Brother, Knight of the West, Riddare of Vester, Vacates, Chapter, part of the Old Strict Observance. Enlightened Brother of St. John's Lodge, Fortrogenbroder of Johanneslogen, 9, Chapter, part of the Old Strict Observance. Very Enlightened Brother of St. Andrew's Lodge, Fortrogenbroder of Andreaslogen, 10, Chapter, part of the Old Strict Observance. Most Enlightened Brother, Knight and Commander of the Red Cross, RNK, Riddare och Kommendör med Röda Korset, Grand Lodge of Sweden, reserved for Grand Lodge officers and provincial masters. The Royal Order of Karl XIII stands as a distinctive recognition within Swedish Freemasonry. Unlike traditional regalia, often reserved for use within the lodge, this civil order can be worn publicly, signifying one's attainment of the highest degree without violating the established convention that Swedish Rite Masons refrain from displaying Masonic attire outside lodge ceremonies. Conferred at the discretion of the King, the order is exclusively bestowed upon Masons who have attained the 11th degree of the Swedish Rite. Though it is granted only to a select few, the Royal Order of Karl XIII is neither a separate degree nor an extension of ritual. It is, above all, a profound honour, reflecting the pinnacle of Masonic commitment within this tradition. The Swedish Rite stands as a unique and highly structured expression of Freemasonry, distinguished by its Christian foundation, royal patronage, and carefully integrated degree system. Unlike other Masonic traditions, which often function as independent yet loosely connected bodies, the Swedish Rite maintains a cohesive, continuous path of initiation, ensuring that each degree builds upon the last in a meaningful and deliberate manner, rooted in centuries of tradition yet remarkably preserved in its original form. The Rite continues to shape the Masonic experience in Sweden, Scandinavia, and beyond. As a system that seamlessly intertwines symbolism, philosophy, and historical continuity, it remains one of the most structured and philosophically profound expressions of Freemasonry in the modern world. Before this story begins, a word of respect. The presenter speaks as an outsider, an Australian scholar addressing an American subject, aware that to explore another nation's heritage is, as it were, to swim in someone else's pond. What follows is not a polemic, but an historical appreciation, an account grounded in verifiable sources, examined with reverence for accuracy and for the people whose story it tells. It is offered in the spirit of fraternity, scholarship, and truth. Boston Harbor, March 1775. The city stirs with the noise of empire, soldiers on the wharf, the smell of tanned leather, the murmuring of taverns. Amidst this bustle, 15 free black men assemble beneath the banner of a travelling military lodge of the British Army, its number 441 on the roll of the Grand Lodge of Ireland. Under the light of a single lantern, these men, including a leatherworker and community leader named Prince Hall, kneel to receive the degrees of Freemasonry. Thus begins one of the most remarkable sagas in the moral history of the Atlantic world. Prince Hall himself remains an elusive figure. His date and place of birth are uncertain. Some early sources, now regarded with skepticism, suggested Barbados, while most modern scholars, including historian James Sidbury of Rice University, situate his life firmly in New England. By the 1770s, Hall was a literate, property-owning freeman in Boston, a leather craftsman and small-scale entrepreneur, a Methodist preacher, and an outspoken advocate for education among black Bostonians. He petitioned the Massachusetts legislature in 1777 for the establishment of a school for African American children, arguing, in language echoing the Enlightenment, that every rational being hath a right to the advantage of education. Such petitions, preserved in the Massachusetts archives, show a man both pragmatic and visionary, a craftsman with the moral clarity of a reformer. In that same Enlightenment spirit, Hall was drawn to the fraternity of Freemasonry, whose teachings of liberty, equality, and brotherhood resonated with his conviction that black men too were heirs to the dignity of reason. Yet the lodges of colonial Boston were closed to him. When Hall and his companions applied to the White St. John's Lodge, they were rejected, purely on grounds of race. Refusing exclusion, Hall sought Masonic light elsewhere. The military lodge attached to the 38th Regiment of Foot under the Irish warrant accepted the petition. On the 6th of March 1775, Hall and his brethren were initiated. Their new lodge, called simply the African Lodge, was permitted to meet, process in public, and bury its dead, but not to confer degrees. When the British troops departed at the end of the Revolutionary War, the lodge was left in limbo. Prince Hall, aware that Masonic legitimacy rested on chartered authority, petitioned the Grand Lodge of England. After years of correspondence across the war-torn Atlantic, a formal warrant was issued on the 29th of September 1784, naming the body African Lodge Number 459 on the English registry. The original document, still preserved in Boston's Masonic archives, arrived by ship 3 years later and was read aloud in May 1787. With that act, African Lodge Number 459 became, as historian Anne Seymour wrote in her 2020 American Heritage article, The Secret History of Prince Hall Freemasonry, the first black institution in the United States to hold legal standing under British authority. It was, in every technical sense, a regular Masonic lodge. Its only difference lay in the colour of its members' skin. Hall himself served as master and later received from England the title of Provincial Grand Master for African Lodges in North America. In 1791, he authorized lodges in Philadelphia and Providence. By his death in 1807, they had formed a rudimentary African Grand Lodge. Afterward, as Seymour notes, his followers renamed it in his honor, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge, a name now borne by jurisdictions across the world. Let their color be what it will. In 1797, addressing his brethren in Boston, Prince Hall delivered words that remain luminous with moral courage. Give the right hand of affection and fellowship to whom it justly belongs. Let their color and complexion be what it will. Let their nation be what it may, for they are your brethren, and it is your indispensable duty to do so. Those lines survive in his published charge to the African Lodge, printed in Boston that year and reissued by blackpast.org. They testify to a man who understood fraternity as moral universality, yet the new republic refused to hear him. White Grand Lodges in America declined to recognize the African Lodge's charter, even though it came from the same English authority that had chartered their own. Their objections were cloaked in the language of exclusive jurisdiction, the doctrine that only one Grand Lodge could operate within a state, but the underlying motive was racial exclusion. As Masonic historian Christopher Hoddap has written, African Lodge was regular in every sense, except the one that mattered most in America. It was black. Exclusion and endurance. Throughout the 19th century, Prince Hall Freemasonry developed as a parallel world. Lodges multiplied, first in the northeast, then following the Great Migration of freedmen into the South and Midwest after the Civil War. Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Georgia all saw Prince Hall Grand Lodges established before the century's end. Yet recognition never came. In 1875, the Southern Masonic writer Albert Pike, a former Confederate officer, expressed his opposition with chilling clarity. "I took my obligations to white men, not to Negroes," he wrote. "When I have to accept Negroes as brothers or leave Masonry, I shall leave it." These words, printed in Pike's correspondence and later cited in Roger J. Williams' study Prince Hall Masonic Recognition, The First Step, 1983, have been contested by some scholars who argue they were private rather than official. Still, they reveal the sentiment that dominated mainstream American Masonry for generations. Despite exclusion, black Masons flourished. Harold Holzer, historian of the early Republic, observed that for free, blacks in northern cities, lodges and churches provided the only autonomous institutions in which African Americans could assemble without white supervision. In that crucible of limited freedom, Prince Hall lodges became schools of leadership, their rituals blending moral discipline with civic training. As Holzer notes, it was not only a place of secrecy, but of self-formation. The founding of Mother Bethel, Philadelphia, 1791. Inside St. George's Methodist Church, black worshippers are ordered to move to the balcony during prayer. Among them stand two Prince Hall Masons, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. They rise, refuse humiliation, and walk out. With support from their Masonic brethren, they found the Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first independent black denomination in America. Historians of the AME Church record that Prince Hall lodges provided moral and material backing for Allen and Jones, and the church's stained glass windows still display Masonic symbols in gratitude. The story is not allegory. It is documentation of how the Masonic ideal of human equality seeded the growth of black religious autonomy. Prince Hall himself supported early plans for African resettlement, part of the late 18th century Back to Africa movement promoted by the British abolitionist Granville Sharp. But his primary commitment was to education and civic virtue at home. In letters preserved in Boston's archives, he argued that moral improvement would break down the walls of ignorance and prejudice. By the mid-19th century, Prince Hall lodges extended throughout the Free States. In 1847, several of them formed a National Grand Lodge, sometimes called the National Compact, hoping to unite their efforts. Yet internal disagreements over state autonomy caused schism. By the 1870s, the national body had fractured into competing jurisdictions. From these divisions emerged two principal streams still recognized today. Prince Hall affiliated Grand Lodges, tracing descent from the Massachusetts body, and Prince Hall Origin Lodges, descended from the National Compact. The distinction is technical but important, and modern scholars such as Alton Roundtree have cautioned against treating Prince Hall Masonry as a single monolith. Even so, the fraternity's moral stature grew. After emancipation, Prince Hall lodges became vital engines of mutual aid, offering burial insurance, education funds, and social leadership. By the early 20th century, their members included ministers, teachers, businessmen, and professionals, the very backbone of the black middle class. The Lincoln Meeting, Washington, D.C., August 1862. President Abraham Lincoln summons 5 black leaders to the White House. Among them, 4 are Prince Hall Masons. Lincoln proposes colonization, the voluntary emigration of freed slaves to Central America. "Your people," he says, "are the cause of the war." The delegation listens, then declines. They answer, in dignified tones recorded by contemporary newspapers, that African Americans are native to this country and intend to remain, As historian Seymour remarks, their refusal quietly redirected the course of emancipation. Without their intervention, she writes, there might be no Black Washington today. This moment exemplifies the moral poise taught within lodge rooms, restraint without submission, reason over anger, courage expressed through calm. From segregation to civil rights. After Reconstruction, Prince Hall Masonry spread with migration. By 1900, there were established Grand Lodges in most states, including in the South, where racial terror was endemic. Even under Jim Crow, lodges served as sanctuaries for civic organization. In Mississippi, the M.W. Stringer Grand Lodge building in Jackson, completed in 1955, became headquarters for the state NAACP. When civil rights leader Medgar Evers, himself a Prince Hall Mason, was assassinated in 1963, his funeral was held there. Anne Seymour notes that the Stringer Temple became the heart of the civil rights struggle in Mississippi, a Masonic edifice serving as both fortress and forum. Across the nation, Prince Hall lodges provided meeting halls for the NAACP, the Urban League, and later the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As the civil rights historian Aldon Morris observes in The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, Free Press, 1984, such institutions formed the organizational backbone of protest. In that sense, Prince Hall Masonry functioned as a hidden architecture of freedom. Among its members were many who shaped 20th century America: labor leader A. Philip Randolph, organizer of the 1963 March on Washington; civil rights strategist Ralph Abernathy; Congressman John Lewis of Georgia, whose activism stretched from Selma to the Capitol; and the jurist Thurgood Marshall, architect of Brown v. Board of Education. All were Prince Hall Masons. As historian Christopher Hodapp summarized, 90% of the founders of Black Greek letter fraternities had Masonic ties. The lodge was the seedbed of leadership. The Lodge and the Dream, Atlanta, early 1960s. On Auburn Avenue, the headquarters of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference, stands next door to the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Georgia. Beneath that roof, ministers, lawyers, and activists, many of them Masons, meet in the evenings to plan boycotts and marches. The historian Ed Bowen, himself a 33-degree Mason, later recalled, "Most of the ministers on Auburn Avenue were Masons. So were the doctors and the lawyers. The lodge was where you got things done." Though King himself was never initiated, his father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., was a member, and rumors long persisted that the younger King had been made a Mason posthumously. Grandmaster Benjamin Barksdale later clarified that no such posthumous initiation occurred, but the very plausibility of the rumor illustrates the fraternity's intimate presence within the civil rights generation. Recognition and reconciliation. For more than 2 centuries, mainstream, predominantly white, Grand Lodges in America withheld recognition from their Prince Hall counterparts. As late as 1947, when the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts briefly granted recognition, pressure from southern jurisdictions forced a retraction. The historian Elton Roundtree remarks that, for decades, the wall of segregation within Masonry mirrored the wall of segregation in the nation. A change of conscience began only in the 1980s. In 1989, the Grand Lodge of Connecticut voted to recognize the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of that state, the first such act in the United States. Within a decade, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Colorado followed. Hodapp describes this moment as a collective realization that the fraternity had become a prisoner of its own past. by the early 21st century, most states had acted. Yet, the Deep South lagged. As late as 2017, 6 Grand Lodges, among them Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Arkansas, and West Virginia, still withheld recognition. Gradually, they relented. In 2021, the Grand Lodge of Tennessee extended recognition. Later that year, Georgia followed, passing the motion by overwhelming vote. These developments were documented by HODAP and corroborated in official Grand Lodge proceedings. Recognition, in Masonic terms, means mutual acknowledgement of legitimacy and the right of members to visit one another's lodges. It does not imply merger. Prince Hall and mainstream Grand Lodges remain sovereign, parallel institutions united by respect. As one Southern Grand Master phrased it after the vote, "We have discovered that we are, after all, of the same light." The Funeral of John Lewis, Atlanta, 2020. The body of Congressman John Lewis lies in state. For the first time in Georgia's history, officers of both the Prince Hall Grand Lodge and the mainstream Grand Lodge stand together to conduct a joint Masonic funeral. As reported by Anne Seymour, 2 centuries of separation were, for an hour, dissolved. The image of white and black Masons side by side, their aprons gleaming under the cathedral lights, became a parable of reconciliation achieved through ritual. Global reach. Today, Prince Hall Freemasonry extends far beyond American borders. Grand Lodges exist in Canada, the Caribbean, Liberia, and West Africa. Lodges under Prince Hall jurisdiction operate on US military bases across Europe and Asia, their banners carried wherever American soldiers serve. In 1993, a Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the Caribbean was inaugurated in Barbados. In 2022, one was chartered in São Paulo, Brazil. Membership estimates vary, but most scholars, including Alton Roundtree, place the global figure around 300,000 members in over 5,000 lodges, making it the largest predominantly African-American fraternal organization in existence. In 1996, the United Grand Lodge of England formally declared Prince Hall lodges regular and in amity, thus closing a circle opened more than 2 centuries earlier. The present and the promise. Modern Prince Hall Masonry stands as both an heir to and a custodian of history. Its members sponsor scholarships, support historically black colleges, and engage in community philanthropy. Youth programs, such as the Knights of Pythagoras, teach leadership to adolescents. In cities from Boston to Los Angeles, lodge halls host food drives, literacy classes, and voter registration events. Prince Hall Masonry remains predominantly African American, yet racially open. Men of all ethnicities may petition its lodges, just as black men now freely join mainstream ones. The old barriers have crumbled. But the fraternity's cultural distinctiveness endures, a lineage of resilience, service, and spiritual dignity. As Christopher Hodap observed in an interview for American Heritage, Prince Hall Masonry survives not because it is separate, but because it is faithful to its founder's vision of universal brotherhood and moral excellence. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons for Freemasons. Visit FromTheQuarries.com or YouTube at From the Quarries.